yesterday, and here on Breakfast Central we realize it's important to have these conversations with you. Now, did you know that Nigeria's tourism sector has the potential to attract substantial foreign exchange earnings? As the world marked World Tourism Day yesterday, ripples of the untamed opportunities in the giant of Africa's ecosystem continue to reverberate.
Now, this year's theme, Rethink Tourism, is an excellent stroke to kickstart the conversation of getting our rich tourism borders open and running for economic development and growth. Now, joining us on Breakfast Central to expand on Nigeria's rich tourism potential is it's also sustainability, also strategic leadership, tourism, travel, and so much more, is a cultural expert, Adunola Okupe. Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Adunola, I would like you to please unmute your microphone. And whilst that's going on, thank you for joining us. I would like you to start by talking to us about the potentials that there are for Nigeria's tourism sector. From your perspective, what would you say these potentials are? Adunola, are you there with us? Can you please unmute your device? It doesn't seem that you're unmuted yet. I mean, world tourism. Yes, we are certainly talking about, some of the potentials that abound when it comes to tourism in Nigeria. Some days ago, we had this conversation on air, and I was talking to you about, we talked about the Badagry Museum, Badagry Slave Trade Road. We've talked about the fact that beyond our slave trade stories, we have so many beautiful things to showcase, our beaches. The interesting thing is, we're surrounded by our coast. We're surrounded by water, but we're not yet able to maximize that. I really don't know how we can make, how we can do that.
It's mostly because, there is not that, level of interest, So people who really do tourism, if you remember from Bettina's package, they do a gorilla naming ceremony, and that's because the government is aware of the value that this brings financially, and they invest in it. They make sure it's a safe environment. They make sure that they have the infrastructure to ensure that those things are possible. And so we haven't done enough of that yet, if we're being honest. I remember a couple of years ago, there was a friend who used to try to, create his own tourism sector for the Southeast. But of course, it wasn't very successful because there were still challenges here and there with transportation, with the infrastructure and all of that. And so it's just not a conversation that we've really
prioritized.
Yeah.
Because we travel out of Nigeria, for example, you go to somewhere like Tunisia and you're staying in the resorts, and the beaches, typically the beaches that are on the water, the resorts are more expensive than regular hotels in the city. And I once lived at a place that was near a beach, but the beach was, it was very badly maintained. I saw that.
Exactly.
Every time I would go to the beach, I would just keep thinking to myself, the amount of money that is wasting here.
Absolutely.
Imagine people traveling in from outside. I mean, we're starting to develop that. There's a property here in Victoria Island. There's an area in Victoria Island that they're now starting to build houses by the water. Lots of people are exploring that. But, you rightly mentioned, referring to the chimpanzee naming ceremony, the gorilla naming ceremony, we have a lot of ceremonies here, a lot of festivals that we haven't seemed to fully embrace. We have the New Yam Festival that happens, so how can we then package? I think it's time to start having conversations on how we can package our local events and make them, export them to the world. What we find is Nigerians, we're entering October, right? Very soon they're going to start Halloween. It's not really our tradition.
Yeah, but we have adopted Halloween.
So we can export ours as well.
Yeah, but unfortunately, we just don't have that level of interest. We have a minister for tourism that barely speaks about tourism. He focuses more on information. Unfortunately, those two sectors are merged together, under the same person. So it's just not of that level of interest. I remember growing up when we used to have the Argungun Festival. It used to be on national television back then. This is 15 years ago, 20 years ago. It used to be on national television. It was a joy to just watch it. And I remember that people used to throng those areas. I'm not sure what part of the north that used to happen. There used to be a massive crowd there just watching the fishing festival. And, for those who wanted to partake also, you could see them also bringing out the biggest fishes. I saw some of the biggest fishes back then on television. But all that doesn't exist anymore. If you remember, Calabar used to have its festival every year. Every December, people used to travel all the way to Calabar, book hotels as early as August, in September.
In fact, they started booking now for
Calabar
so
you can get a spot there. But all of that doesn't exist anymore because tourism is really not, part of the conversation. And of course, security challenges that we've also experienced in the long while.
I don't think it's really just about the security challenges, because even before we started having security challenges on this scale, I don't think we prioritize it as much.
No, we
what
haven't.
we find is that a lot of people, when they have the money, they are prioritizing going on holiday to Europe and to the Middle East, which is great. But how are we going to be able to, the shocking thing is, if we were to do a poll and ask how many people have explored the seeming tourism hotspots in Nigeria, in Lagos, those of us who live in Lagos, how many people have been to the Nike art galleries, the places that have become tourism hotspots, the Lekki Arts and Crafts Market, talking about, we even do have a sea market here in VI. So all these places that can be tourism hotspots, how have we even embraced them? A lot of us have not explored them. And I'm hoping that through this conversation we're having, we're charging people who are watching the best way that you can. You can't sell something that you haven't bought yourself. So if we're able to, one day make tourism as attractive to the world, we must be able to buy it ourselves. We have Adunola Okupe, who is joining us this morning. She is a sustainability, strategic leadership, tourism, travel, and cultural expert. Good morning, Adunola. We hope that we can connect with you this time.
Right, good morning. Thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, we've been speaking extensively about tourism, but you are the expert here. Talk to us about the potentials that lie here for Nigeria's tourism sector.
Right, okay. So first of all, it's important that we are able to appreciate that World Tourism Day, looks at rethinking tourism for Africa. And within that context, we see that it's a developing economy context. And so it's really understanding that we cannot be looking at more developed and more established markets as benchmarks to see where we are. I would say that we've come quite a long way, right, in tourism in Nigeria, at least in the last 15 years that I've been practicing, and the opportunities really abound. And so what COVID has really shown us is that we really need to look at domestic tourism. We need to look inwards. We have a market of 200 million people. Even countries like India, Britain, right, they have significantly more domestic tourism than they have international tourism. And it's important to then say, how do we develop a culture of traveling? Right now, Nigerians travel a lot for festivals, for ceremonies, for weddings, for funerals, for parties. But how do we also start to look at that in a more holistic way to say, how do we learn more about other cultures? How do we experience other cultures? So the experiences are there, and the opportunities are across the tourism system. It's really about providing the right attractions, the right accommodation facilities, both for budget travelers as well as for the luxury end of the travel market. One thing that we're seeing is a lot of focus on the higher end of the travel market. And it's important that rethinking tourism sees that tourism has to be accessible for all. And I think finally, the other opportunity I would say is that we have quite a lot of business tourists coming into Nigeria. How do we ensure that they're able to stay for a couple more days and also spend more money while they're in the country by providing information, by providing access, and also by providing comfortable lodging and interesting and exciting attractions that they can tap into.
Okay, well, one thing that I had previously mentioned was the challenge of insecurity. It has often been labeled as a bottleneck stopping tourism's growth in Nigeria. Is this true? And is this the only bottleneck that you can point out?
Well, I want to say that, when we're looking at solving problems or solving challenges, it's important to think about how to solve it through the entire, from the root cause to through the entire spectrum of what the problem or the challenge is. I would say that insecurity is a symptom of something else, and some of those other things are concerns about livelihoods, people not feeling included and having hope in the future. So how do we solve that problem? The second thing I would say is really, I'm not trying to say that because there's insecurity everywhere else in the world, that doesn't mean we should address it. But it's important that we also understand that, countries like South Africa, the United Kingdom, the US, countries around the world also have insecurity, right? But the difference is that when things happen, right, it's how we manage it. It's also how we address the perception. And there is work to do. Part of what we are doing as Red Clay is engaging with government, security agencies, etc., to see how we can address this. But one thing I also want to say is that when we think about tourism and we think about sustainable tourism, it includes the local communities. Once they can see that their livelihoods they can have better livelihoods from tourism activity, then they themselves become the custodians, they themselves become your security, they themselves, instead of being disenfranchised youth, become those that are going to protect the communities. So again, it's about looking at the root cause of the challenge, of the problem, right? Unemployment, disenfranchisement, and saying, how do we solve this? And one thing that tourism definitely does, because of its low barriers to entry, is that it provides a way for people to join in and to also have livelihoods that can be sustained.
I mean, you've talked about several points that the government can take note of. What hope is there for Nigeria's tourism sector? And if you could sit face to face with the people, the leaders, the ones who make the changes, what would you say to them concerning Nigeria's tourism space and how the government can be of influence?
Right, that's a very good question. Well, one thing I would say is that there's definitely hope. So yesterday we launched a report looking at understanding residents' perspectives in tourism, leisure, and recreation, because we see that tourism isn't only about inbound, international tourists or even people coming from other places. It's also about residents understanding and enjoying the attractions they have around them. And so the fact that we are going to continue to have a large population just shows us that the potential and the market is going to be there. What we tell government, and we're lucky that we're able to work with governments across states and also at the national level, is that it's important that you see things as, you see things as a continuum. And so each administration has to look at continuity. That's the first thing. The second one is, how do we also ensure that our tourism master plans are implemented? How are we tracking this? How are we monitoring progress, right? And it's also that sense of how are we also integrating with other allied sectors so that different players know how they can key into this. Because one thing we definitely need to achieve our tourism potential is more investment. And as we look at rethinking tourism and as we look at accessibility, one way we need to look at it is saying, how do we also ensure that for people with physical and mental disabilities, the tourism industry welcomes them both to visit the attractions, but also to work in the industry. And so there's just so much to do. We're focusing on education. And part of what we're telling government as well is that even within public sector, the tourism boards, that they are empowered and they have the capability to regulate the industry, as well as within private sector, that hotel investors, owners, and people working in middle management also understand how they can contribute to the growth of the sector.
All right, it's a conversation that should never end until we start to see improvements here and there on the federal level and on the state level, and of course, across the country, across the continent also. Adunola, thank you so much for your time this morning. It was very interesting speaking with you. And happy World Tourism Day. I don't know if I can still say
or rather,
that.
happy World Tourism Week, as far as we're concerned.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, Breakfast Central, of course, continues. We have a lot more to talk about. Remember, in the second half, we still will be moving into politics. But let's take a short break. We'll be back.